Hello and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. Today, we're looking at another one of those videos where Greg Koukl and Amy Hall of the Stand to Reason channel answer listener questions. This one is about evidence and reasons for belief and unbelief. So let's take a look.
This first question comes from Gary.
Did she say Gary? God damn it, just a second. Gary?
Yeah?
Have you been calling apologists again?
Of course not. Why would I do that?
I don't know, man. You do weird things sometimes. Greg Koukl's just answering a listener question from a guy named Gary, and I guess I just assumed that you were up to shenanigans again. I'm sorry for making assumptions.
No worries.
Hello from sunny Florida.
Hello, Eric.
Why wasn't Saul impressed with the evidence? Apologists claim the evidence for the resurrection is very strong, yet Saul had access to all the evidence and all the eyewitnesses for 3 years. He wasn't convinced until he had a, quote, heavenly vision. Why should educated non-Christians today trust apologists' claims that the evidence is strong if Saul and the overwhelming majority of first-century Jews found it insufficient?
That's actually a really good question. Now, keep in mind here that the Paul who wrote most of the New Testament and Saul are the same person. I'm just going to call him Paul. So, what we're talking about here is probably the most important figure in Christianity, and he wasn't convinced by evidence. He was convinced when Jesus actually showed up and gave him a personal experience. And I've been talking about this for years at this point. If God wants to convince people, he knows what it will take, and he has the ability to do it. He did it for Paul, who, according to the story, was actively hunting down and executing Christians, so why would he not do it for Christians whose faith is slipping and who are desperately asking for a sign of some kind?
Well, it's not clear to me that the overwhelming majority of first century Jews were giving it an even-handed assessment.
Really? Isn't one of the main apologetics regarding the resurrection the fact that anyone could have just popped into the Jerusalem graveyard and checked the tomb for the body themselves, and therefore we can trust that the first century Jews would have spoken up and stopped the spread of Christianity with their facts and logic if it weren't true? It's a shit argument to be sure, but the idea that first century Jews weren't giving Christianity a fair shake completely undermines it. But also, as long as we're talking about evidence, do you have evidence that they weren't giving it a fair shake? Y'all constantly want us to give the benefit of the doubt about the internal monologues of people who lived thousands of years ago in order to make your case look stronger than it is. That's the whole criterion of embarrassment, after all. At what point are you going to bring actual evidence to the table? This looks very much like you are just offhandedly dismissing a pretty big data point because it doesn't lead to your preferred conclusion.
First of all, okay, according to the record, Jesus was crucified.
According to what record? I mean, honestly, this is one of the facts about the guy that I have no problem granting generally, if only because of how mundane it is. After all, plenty of people were crucified by the Romans for plenty of reasons. The idea that an apocalyptic preacher got on their bad side is completely unremarkable to me. But we don't really have a record of it. We have stories that were written down about it a minimum of 30 years after the events, which we know were wrong about a lot of things and often include mutually exclusive details. And there's also one mention by the Roman historian Tacitus, which amounts to Christians believe that he was executed by Pilate. That really isn't much of a record.
Because the Jewish leadership whipped the crowd into a frenzy before Pilate to ask for Barabbas rather than Jesus.
Yeah, so that is one of those things that we know was wrong. Well, know about as confidently as can be possible for events of the ancient past. There are a grand total of 0 sources outside of the Gospels that make any mention whatsoever of the Passover pardon custom. As far as we can tell, that was purely a literary device to tie Jesus in with the Old Testament scapegoat ritual, and with some nice symbolic meaning to boot. In the oldest and most reliable manuscripts, Barabbas is actually named Jesus Barabbas, and Barabbas translates to son of the Father. So this presents the people who brought Jesus to Pilate with a choice. Which Jesus, the son of the Father, do you prefer? The one who offers forgiveness of sins, or the violent murderer? It's all quite symbolic, and the coincidence of the names would, in and of itself, call into question the historicity of the event, but when you combine that with zero evidence of any Roman governor in Judea or elsewhere having any sort of custom that even remotely resembles the one described in the Bible, as well as the other sources we have for Pilate's rule in Judea, which show him being cruel towards the Jews, sometimes going out of his way to offend their religious sensibilities, it is pretty much a sure thing that the Passover pardon was not a thing.
And that's just one example. And the text says that Pilate understood it was through envy. But we have a lot of other examples that are mentioned in the text that anybody who would show favor to Jesus would be thrown out of the synagogue.
I assume here that he's talking about John 9:22, where it says that if anyone should confess Jesus to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. But that is a passage that scholars agree was more reflective of the time in which it was written, around 90 CE, rather than of the time that Jesus was actually alive. For most of the first century, Christians were at least tolerated in the synagogues. Christianity itself was seen as a sect of Judaism, and we even see evidence for this in the Bible. The book of Acts repeatedly tells the story of Paul traveling to a new town and beginning his ministry there by preaching in the synagogue, which explicitly included Gentiles, indicating that Gentiles going to the synagogue on Sabbath was a fairly normal thing, and that it wouldn't be forbidden for Christians to preach in the synagogues. It wasn't until after the destruction of the temple that Christians began to be excluded from the synagogues, and even then, synagogues were largely independent organizations, so despite the Jewish benediction against heretics likely being composed around the same time as the book of John, with some scholars suggesting that John 9:22 is actually a reference to it, there was likely no top-down universal exclusion of Christians at the time, and the separation of Christianity from Judaism continued at a slow pace that spanned decades to centuries, with there being some evidence that Jews would shield Christians from Roman persecution by including them in the synagogues, thus allowing them to claim the Jewish exemption from the imperial cult. Either way, if it happened abruptly around 70 to 90 CE, or if it happened slowly over centuries, it was definitely not the case that Christians were put out of the synagogues during the time when Paul was conducting his ministry, because a part of his ministry was preaching in the synagogues. Now, it is quite possible that the Johannine Christians were excluded from their local synagogues, prompting the author of John to write about their exclusion, but there is very little evidence to suggest that this exclusion was anywhere close to universal.
Okay, So even Nicodemus in John chapter 3, one of the most respected leaders of that group, came to Jesus by night to have a conversation with him and acknowledged, he said, nobody could do the works that you do.
And that's actually a really interesting point of contrast with the Synoptic Gospels. All throughout the Synoptics, Mark in particular, Jesus conceals his identity, even from the people who knew him best. When demons recognize him, he silences them to stop them from blowing his cover. When he heals people, he tells them not to say anything about it to anyone. When he reveals himself in all of his glory to 3 of his disciples, he does it in private and commands them to tell no one until after the resurrection. When he feeds the multitudes in the Synoptics, he does it out of compassion, but in John, he does it explicitly as a sign to show who he is. After the feeding of the multitudes, in John, it says that they all recognized him as the prophet that has come into the world. Then Jesus does his walking on water thing, and the crowd follows him across the lake. At this point, Jesus chastises the crowd because they're just following him for the free food, not because of the great sign that he just did. To contrast, in Mark, after he feeds the multitudes, he also does the walking on water thing, but when he joins the disciples in the boat, it says that they were utterly astonished because they did not understand about the loaves. All throughout John, he explicitly performs what are called signs in order to prove to people that he is the Son of God. But in Mark and Matthew, he warns that someone performing signs and wonders is a false Christ trying to lead people astray. And in Luke, Jesus is sent to Herod, who is delighted at the prospect of seeing him perform a sign. But Jesus refuses and remains silent. And in Matthew and Luke, we get a passage where Jesus says that it is an evil and adulterous generation that seeks a sign. The only sign that will be given is the sign of Jonah, which is a reference to the upcoming resurrection. So, yes, if we read the book of John, the people at the time had plenty of evidence that Jesus was the Son of God in the signs that he performed in order to provide them with that evidence. But that's not the story that the other 3 Gospels tell. Now, for honesty's sake, I'm going to let you know that the next little bit is going to contain a few cuts. Greg spends a lot of time thinking about what he's about to say, which is fine, but it results in a lot of dead air and ums and uhs, so I'm going to remove them for you. And by I'm going to remove them, I actually mean I'm going to sit on my ass while Piper removes them.
Unless God had done them. So I think what this question does is it underestimates the impact of peer pressure, especially when the peer pressure is a bullying pressure that is in a position to place a penalty on those who don't agree with what they want to agree with.
So, like a church? Try going to an SBC-affiliated church sometime and telling them that you support gay marriage or having women serve as pastors, and see how much peer pressure they're willing to exert to get you to fall into line then.
So all of that makes it it disincentivizes people for looking at the details, closely.
Peer pressure is a bad thing, except when churches do it, I guess.
Secondly, Saul's not the biggest mystery. The biggest mystery is the Jewish leadership who knew that Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead.
Yeah, their denial is so nonsensical that it almost seems like it was actually a literary device inserted into the story to make it match with the older scriptures.
I just put a note down. Yeah.
That's the resurrection of Lazarus, the raising of Lazarus is in John 11, but in John 12 talks about they were plotting to kill Jesus because he had worked such a notable miracle. A lot of people were following him now based on the miracle.
Which is in direct contrast to the story in the Synoptics. I mean, yeah, he does get a following based on his miracles, but it's more personal. It's not some grand, this guy keeps doing things like raising the dead and turning water into wine, so let's follow him because he's clearly a powerful prophet and we want to see what he's going to do next. It's the people that Jesus told not to talk about the fact that he healed them, keep talking about it anyway. So if you or someone you love is in need of healing, follow this Jesus guy around and he might do it for you. The motivation is very different.
This is even before the resurrection of Jesus. And then it says, and they also plotted to kill Lazarus because Lazarus is the living, breathing evidence that Jesus raised him from the dead. Now, this is like a no duh, right? Really? Are you kidding me?
Well, if I were to play devil's advocate here, earlier when I said that it was ridiculous that they'd reject the evidence, that is starting with the assumption that the Bible seems to go with, that the evidence provided is actually sufficient. But as is pointed out in the Synoptics, when Jesus is casting out demons, the people consider the possibility that he's doing so with demonic authority rather than the authority of God. And honestly, his rebuttal of this is rather weak. He basically just says, really? You think Satan is casting out Satan? Obviously that wouldn't happen. A house divided against itself cannot stand. That's like the equivalent of a magician asking his plant in the audience if they've ever met, with the plant responding, no, of course not. Wouldn't be much of a magic show if I were in on it, would it? And then expecting the audience to actually buy it. So if I take these stories seriously, it may be that the Jewish leaders who didn't believe that Jesus was the Son of God were just convinced that he was being given his powers by Satan rather than God, and didn't find his whole Satan wouldn't cast out Satan shtick to be convincing.
But this is what I call unbelievable unbelief. And so it tells us, and this is true even now, even with the preponderance of evidence, people have motivations for not accepting what's obvious.
Or, if you actually read the storybook that you pretend to revere, you can see that there are alternative explanations for why someone would not believe in Jesus, even while he was miracling right in their faces. And given that Jesus' response to the reason they didn't believe is lackluster at best, I would actually be hesitant to put their non-belief in the category of unbelievable unbelief. Because that's the thing a lot of Christian apologists don't seem to be able to grasp. Even if you prove the resurrection beyond a shadow of a doubt, that doesn't actually prove that Jesus was the Son of God, or anything else about Christianity for that matter. If I grant that it proves supernatural intervention and it wasn't like aliens that are just really good at healing people, then you still need to provide evidence supporting your preferred idea about the nature of that intervention. Because it could be something other than Christianity. Like, how do you know that it wasn't a mischievous God who saw what Jesus was doing and thought that raising him from the dead and starting a new religion out of it would be funny? Yeah, I don't think that's a likely explanation, but it's at least as likely as the explanation that Christianity is true, and it's not the only possible non-Christian explanation.
But this is kind of question an atheist would ask. Well, if the evidence is really that good, why didn't Saul believe? The answer is, I can't get into Saul's head. I don't know why Saul didn't believe what was obvious.
Ooh, you're getting pretty close there, Greg. Just one more little step and you'll be at maybe he didn't believe because the evidence wasn't actually all that compelling. Because that is most definitely an option. And it would go a long way toward explaining why he didn't believe until he had his own experience.
Remember, he was told that the Jews stole the body, that the disciples stole the body.
Was he told that? He didn't write about having been told that, though certainly that is an idea that was at least occasionally brought up during Christianity's beginnings, and we know that because the book of Matthew included the guard of the tomb explicitly as an apologetic against that claim, which is actually a pretty good reason to believe that there was no guard at the tomb, if there even was a tomb at all. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that the empty tomb narrative had not yet developed at the time of Paul's conversion. Modern Christians treat it as a super important, super special detail of the story, and yet Paul, the guy who wrote most of the New Testament, never once mentioned a tomb. Closest he comes is saying that Jesus was buried. Of course, this doesn't prove that there was no tomb, but at the same time, can we really just assume that Paul thought there was a tomb and had been exposed to the disciple stole the body claim? That seems to be in the realm of speculation, if you ask me.
The question isn't what was in Saul's head if the evidence is so good. The question is the evidence any good?
And the answer is no.
And when you have an empty tomb, when you have the sightings, when you have the conversions, when you have the origin of the early church, for example,
we have no evidence of an empty tomb story until at least 30 years after the fact. So no, Paul did not have an empty tomb. The sightings were not actual sightings, they were a creed that Christians recited that claimed that there were sightings. Conversions are a normal thing that happens in any religion that doesn't immediately fizzle out. And I thought we were talking about the evidence that Paul had access to here. Given that Paul basically founded the version of Christianity that eventually became the Orthodox, can we really say that the early church was part of that evidence? Okay, well, I guess we can say that the many different sects of Christianity that existed in the first century might have counted as evidence for Paul, but given that he deviated pretty heavily from them and claimed spiritual visions as his inspiration for those deviations, I'm not sure how that would actually fit in.
When you have clearly Jesus was executed on that Roman cross, and you have these things that are not disputed, the question is what best explains all of that, all of those data points.
I would dispute that none of that is disputed, especially the empty tomb stuff, given that Gary Habermas, who is the king of declaring undisputed consensus of facts related to the resurrection, does not include so much as a mention of Jesus' tomb, empty or otherwise, on his list of minimal facts.
And there is no explanation that is offered that collectively explains everything except the explanation of the apostles he was dead, is now alive.
Really? No explanation that you can think of aside from a dead guy coming back to life? Seems like a problem with your lack of imagination more than anything. Personally, I'm partial to Apologia's minimal witnesses hypothesis. One or two disciples had an experience that they interpreted to be a resurrected Jesus, the religion spread through word of mouth, and the stories grew as it spread and were retold, until eventually they became the stories that we know from the Gospels. Pretty simple, explains all the undisputed facts surrounding Jesus, and doesn't require a suspension of everything we know about how the universe works in order to accept. I'll leave a link to Paul's playlist containing his videos on the topic. I have merely brushed up against his ideas here, so go watch his videos if you want more detail.
Okay. Now, if the evidence is so good, why wasn't Paul convinced until later? It is interesting. He was convinced.
Yes, but by personal experience, not by evidence. I'd be happy to be convinced in God's existence if he provided me with a personal experience, but so far, he has declined to acquiesce, even when I was a believing Christian desperately trying to hang on to my faith.
Against his will, as it were.
And that's a good point as well. Oftentimes when I mention that I was a believing Christian desperate for God to show himself to me, I'll be met with dismissal. I wasn't a true Christian. Clearly I didn't really believe, even if I thought I did. Only the true believers get the experience with God, okay? So why did Paul get an experience against his will? Even if I weren't truly a Christian, I was trying to be, so it wouldn't have been against my will. So why does Paul get the experience while I get left hanging?
That itself is a data point.
It's a data point that suggests that Paul may have been inclined to have visions, something that is not unique to Christianity and has plenty of naturalistic explanations ranging from mental illness to the use of drugs to social pressure and more.
But why wasn't he convinced beforehand? I don't know. It doesn't matter.
Why wouldn't it matter? This is the guy who effectively founded Christianity, and you're not the slightest bit interested in why he didn't find Christianity to be convincing? You know how I occasionally comment about how I could make a lot of money by claiming to have had a personal revelation, converting to Christianity, and then turning my channel into an apologetics channel and writing a book or two about my experience? Yeah, this attitude of not caring about why such an important figure in Christianity didn't find the evidence for Christianity to be compelling supports my idea. Which is making me think that perhaps Paul's conversion was merely a result of how easy it is to grift Christians by pretending to be in their club. And if you somehow don't think that's an easy grift, may I just present the existence of Donald Trump to you? Dude clearly isn't a Christian in any meaningful sense of the word, but because he pays lip service to Christianity, he gets their unwavering support, even when behaving in a way that would have Jesus spinning in his empty tomb.
You have all kinds of things that people believe that there's plenty of good evidence for that counters their belief.
Yeah, and that's why it's important to always be willing to re-examine your beliefs in light of new evidence.
There's still some flat earthers. There are geocentrists around.
Yeah, there are. And guess which religion they usually wind up belonging to? I'll give you 3 guesses. But those 3 guesses are actually only 1 guess, because we all know it's Christianity, the religion where 3 equals 1.
So my point is this. To the naysayers, to the heliocentrists, to the people who actually think the earth is a globe. If the evidence were so good, then why aren't these people believing?
And that really is the question, isn't it? Why do people believe things for which there is no evidence, or for which there is evidence that overwhelmingly counters the thing that they believe? Well, if I knew the answer to that, I'd know how to end religion, so unfortunately, it remains rather elusive.
Do you see what a nonsense question that is? Mm-hmm. Takes you nowhere.
Greg, are you okay, buddy? Do you need to take a break or something? Because that question that you just said is nonsense is basically a whole field of psychological study. It's very young earth creationist-y of you to deny the existence of an entire scientific field of study.
It takes you nowhere. What you have to do is look at the evidence, not at whether or not people believe, and ask whether the evidence is compelling. If you don't think it's compelling, then don't believe.
Oh, okay, great. I don't think it's compelling, so I won't believe. Surely you'll have a live and let live approach to my non-belief, right? You won't write an entire book dedicated to manipulating conversations in order to trick atheists into superficially agreeing with you as long as they stay on script, right? Oh, wait, you already wrote that book. And actively engage in culture war nonsense advocating against LGBTQ and women's rights. So maybe stick to your message here.
But you can't disqualify the evidence because somebody else didn't believe.
That's not what's happening here. This isn't actually analogous to a modern flat earther ignoring all of the evidence for the globe. Paul actually would not have had access to anywhere close to the same amount of evidence as we have for the globe, even in the best case scenario. If we put ourselves in Paul's shoes and assume that apologists are correct in everything that they say, then what he had was a handful of people he could talk to who saw a resurrected Jesus, and maybe, if his position with the Jewish council was high enough, an empty tomb to examine. That's really all there was. I don't see how that could be all that compelling to someone who is even slightly skeptically inclined.
You don't know their psychological circumstances, but we do know from the record a lot of the social pressures that were around it. By the way, even though the majority of the Jews didn't believe, all of the early church, almost entirely up until first century, were Jewish.
You say that as though it's a surprise. Jesus was Jewish, collecting Jewish followers in a Jewish country, so yeah, the first converts after his death were also Jewish. Remember, Paul preached in the synagogues, and while he did say some things that indicated that there was at least a bit of a Gentile presence in the synagogues at the time, the overwhelming majority of his audience there would have been Jewish. That's why a good chunk of the New Testament is devoted to Paul fighting with other early Christians about whether or not Gentile converts should be required to also convert to Judaism, with Paul emphasizing that they should not. Anyway, remember all the way back to the beginning of the video where I pointed out that Paul's preaching in the synagogues was evidence that Christians were not put out of the synagogues? Yeah, apparently Greg is aware of that fact and just chooses to selectively ignore it when it suits him.
I guess I don't understand why someone would think that this point, based on the question, is somehow compelling to them.
It's not so much that it's compelling all on its own, but when combined with the fact that apologists are regularly harping on about how strong the evidence is, and one of their key pieces of evidence is the list of witnesses that Paul writes about in 1 Corinthians 15, it does make us wonder, if that were really such great evidence, Why is it that it didn't convince Paul? One of the supposed strengths of that particular bit of evidence is that it's a creed that many scholars agree existed within a few years of Jesus' death. Another supposed strength is that the people listed in it were still alive, so they would be out there correcting the record if people were spreading lies about them. The idea that Paul would be completely unaware of the creed and the people mentioned in it during the time when he was persecuting Christianity is pretty extraordinary, wouldn't you say? So when we put this all together, we wind up at a place where one of the pieces of evidence for Christianity that is routinely touted by apologists to be some of the strongest evidence that they have wasn't actually strong enough to convince the guy who basically founded Christianity, and for whom it would have been an even more compelling case because he was alive at a time when he could have asked the people who were actually named in the creed. So why should I consider it to be compelling today when a guy who would have been able to actually talk to some of the witnesses apparently did not find it compelling?
And I think a good question is, why would the church grow at all in Jerusalem where people had the ability to see the evidence? Why would it grow at all? And it did grow very quickly.
That's right.
If the evidence was bad.
Greg just spent a bunch of time deriding Gary for asking his question because so many people believe crazy shit with bad evidence. Why do you think the people of first century Judea were so much better at critical thinking than people today? And really, I've been too generous with the argument up to this point. How could the people even check to see if it was true? Even if I grant the empty tomb, disturbing graves in the first century Roman Empire was a crime that carried the death penalty, so anyone who went spelunking through the tombs to check for bodies would be risking winding up on a cross themselves if they were caught. So they can't check the tomb, and the list of witnesses was too vague to be useful. I mean, there are 500 of them! Okay, who are they? I don't know. It doesn't say. Okay, well, what of the people that it did mention? Were they making themselves available to just anyone who wanted to cross-examine their story? Did they stay in Jerusalem the whole time? I would think not, based on Paul having a meeting with a few of them in Rome, so these guys are wandering around to who knows where. So can we really say that your average Judean Joe could check the details anytime he wanted to?
That's another question you can ask.
Listen, there were lots of individuals in the first century that claimed to be the Messiah. And just before that, you can go and look at the record if people are interested in that. There were lots of people that rose up.
My takeaway from this is that the odds that one of those many messianic figures managed to found a religion that stuck around are much better if there are many of them than if Jesus was unique in that respect. Greg has accidentally admitted here that Jesus was actually rather mundane. He was an apocalyptic messianic preacher in first century Judea, something that there were a lot of. Honestly, the more surprising thing here is that more religions didn't come about from such a hotbed of religious fervor. After all, today we have several religions that trace their roots to a similar but more recent hotbed, the burned over district of New York. We've got Mormons, we've got Adventists, we've got spiritualists. Hell, we even got a sex cult that turned into a silverware company, the Oneida Society. Next time you're eating a meal with your Oneida fork, remember, that is a fuck fork.
And even somebody like Bart Ehrman acknowledges that the testimony of the resurrection of Jesus goes back very, very early.
Sure, but I don't see why that matters. It could go back to the very hour in which Jesus is said to have risen from the dead, and that wouldn't actually make it true. That would just make it early. Being more early doesn't make it more true.
This is not invented.
Hold up there, Sparky. What do you mean it isn't invented? Being early does not mean it wasn't invented. It just means it happened fast. That's what she said.
This is just a poor line of reasoning. Now, that doesn't make our view true.
Finally, something we can both agree on.
But it makes this kind of objection silly.
I don't know, man. I feel like you've been grasping at straws here and accidentally contradicting yourself while trying to answer the objection. If it were really such a silly objection, I feel like that wouldn't happen.
And you talked about psychological and social reasons. There's also spiritual reasons. You know, people, they don't want to admit that they have sins. They want to be self-righteous. There are all sorts of reasons that the Pharisees, they wanted power. Mm-hmm. They had all sorts of reasons to not follow Jesus.
I don't know. That just kind of rings hollow to me. The power argument could go either way. I've already mentioned how Paul could have just been opportunistically taking advantage of the early Christian penchant for communism. Sorry, that's a bad word for modern Christians. Communal living. As the preacher, he could live in relative ease off the earnings of others, traveling the world on someone else's dime. That's a pretty alluring life, I'd say. It's not like there's a Bible verse commanding that preachers be paid double after all. Get out of here, 1 Timothy. You're making them look bad.
You know, Paul's the same. He said he had everything. He had arrived. He He was a Jew of Jews, and he was a Pharisee, and he had all of these advantages in society. So there are all sorts of reasons why people wouldn't want to follow, even if they think it's true. They can offer a different explanation for it, like the Pharisees did.
If there's a different explanation for it that doesn't involve Jesus actually being raised from the dead, does that really qualify for even if they think it's true territory? But also, I thought y'all couldn't speak to the psychological states of people living 2,000 years ago. Why are you now suddenly comfortable guessing at the psychological states of these people who just a moment ago you said couldn't be known?
For example, when he drove out demons, they claimed it was because he did it through Satan. So you can even interpret the evidence you're seeing in a different way if you're against that person.
These guys keep making my point for me. Ugh. Do you have any idea how long I researched that bullshit? And now you just come out and say it! Why? Why would you do that to me? Yes, the evidence was at best inconclusive, as can be seen from the fact that the alternate explanations were being floated by the characters in the Bible. And now we, who aren't even there to see the demons being cast out in the first place, are supposed to just assume that Jesus' response to that was adequate, and that this is now evidence that we should consider to be incontrovertible? A little consistency would be nice here.
To which, by the way, Jesus had a great rejoinder. A house divided against itself cannot stand.
How in the ever-loving fuck was that a great rejoinder? Greg, do you believe the magician when he says that he's never met the audience member that he just pulled onto stage? Are you that gullible?
I mean, obviously, that's worked its way into the vernacular of the English language. It's so well known. Now, somebody might say, "Well, you're just trusting that the Gospels say this about Jesus and Lazarus and the Jews and everything." Yeah, well, that's the same text that you're relying on to say that Gamaliel, or rather that Saul of Tarsus, wasn't convinced until he had allegedly seen Jesus.
Oh, absolutely not. The Gospels are not the same text as Paul's letters. They are quite different, and treating them as one single text is entirely inappropriate. For one, Paul is writing about his own experiences. Whether or not he is a reliable narrator of those experiences can be debated, but we have enough first-hand accounts from the guy that we can be reasonably certain that he is actually the primary founder of the religion that became Christianity. And you'll notice that I have repeatedly called Paul the founder of Christianity in this video. That's because of the differences between the different texts of the Bible. The Gospels are much more dubious than Paul's texts. We don't even know who wrote them. They recount events that happened at least 30 years before they were written, and they contain details that nobody could have possibly known, not even eyewitnesses. Like what Jesus did while alone in Gethsemane, or what Jesus and Pilate talked about in their private meeting. They contradict each other in frequently irreconcilable ways, and so on. So no, my using a letter written by Paul is in no way the same as you referencing one of the Gospels.
Well, you can't have it both ways. You can't seize upon a historical text as historical to make your argument, and then when the counter is offered from the same historical text, dismiss the historical text.
Another thing that Greg is missing here is that there is such thing as an internal critique. That's where we look at something with the starting assumption that that thing is true in order to see where it leads. I have done some of that here. It's not having it both ways. It's showing that even if I agree with your starting assumptions, your conclusion is still not warranted. But I don't agree with your starting assumptions, so I don't need to always start from a place of hypothetical agreement when making my argument, just when I'm engaged in an internal critique.
This happens all the time, though. All the time people do this kind of thing.
So I've one little story to illustrate this, because I've encountered this myself. I used to have Mormon missionaries coming to visit me every week, and we would talk about things, and they switched them out, so I talked to a bunch of different ones. And one time there was...
They switched them out.
Well, they're always moving around, so yeah. I don't think that was because of me. But so one of them, I asked him, I said, if I were to convince you for sure that the Mormon church was not true, would you follow the truth or would you follow the church? And he sat there for a second and thought about it, and he said, I'd go with the church.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I can do you one better than that.
If somewhere within the Bible, I were to find a passage that said 2 + 2 = 5, I wouldn't question what I'm reading in the Bible. I would believe it, accept it as true, and then do my best to work it out and to understand it.
Now, is this a gotcha? No, not really. But if you're going to use a story of some random Mormon to illustrate how silly it is that people you don't consider to be Christians would ignore the truth in order to follow their preferred belief, then I get to use this clip to say the same about Christians.
And that just shows you the power of the social pressure.
Yeah.
Your family, your friends, everyone has these expectations of you. You don't want to lose your standing in the community. There are a lot of reasons. We see that throughout the New Testament.
Right.
And if you don't think that modern Christians exert that exact same pressure on their church members, then I've got a bridge I'd like to sell you. Yes, I have used that phrase in 2 videos in a row now. Fuck you, I write the scripts here, not you.
You see people walking away from Jesus for those very reasons.
You also see people staying in churches today for those very reasons. In fact, those are the very reasons I kept my atheism to myself and continued attending church weekly for more than a year after I stopped believing.
As people are pressing him, he said, if I could persuade you that Jesus was who he claimed to be, would you follow him? No. Okay, well, why? What's the point of asking?
I always like to ask that question because I think it gets to the heart of the problem, and that is they don't like the biblical God. They wouldn't follow him even if they thought he was real. So the problem isn't the lack of evidence. The problem is, who do they think God is, and why do they hate them? Right? Hate him.
Now, you've got the cart before the horse there. There is no evidence for God, and there is evidence against the God of the Bible. But if you manage to convince me that he actually did exist, then I would not be able to bring myself to love him. Best I can give you is that I might go through the motions of worship out of pure terror. I wouldn't deny his very existence. That would be stupid. But if I analyze the character of God from the perspective of someone who sees him as a fictional character, I can see quite clearly that he isn't a very good God. Hell, earlier when we were talking about Jesus casting out demons using Satan powers instead of God powers, and his rebuttal is to say a house divided against itself cannot stand. Yeah, so when I was looking for that passage for myself, before Greg brought it up and made my point for me, I searched on Bible Gateway for the phrase, a house divided. The first result was a story in Judges 19 that is basically a different version of the Sodom and Gomorrah story. But it's an old traveling man instead of angels. He's sleeping in the town square, and another old man takes him into his home. Then a crowd of people show up demanding to rape the man. In the Sodom and Gomorrah story, Lot sends his daughters out to them, but they don't want them. They want angel meat. But in this version, the man sends his concubine out to them, and they rape her to death. His response is then to chop her body up into little pieces and mail those pieces to 11 of the 12 tribes of Israel, so they can make war against the tribe of Benjamin, whose territory they were in when that happened. Now, up to this point in the story, I could forgive you for not attributing any of this to God, as it's just a retelling of events, and God doesn't really factor into it all that much. But if we keep reading to chapter 21, we wind up at a place where the tribe of Benjamin has been mostly wiped out because of this, and now the Israelites kind of regret mopping the floor with them so thoroughly. They don't want to lose an entire tribe, but they also swore an oath not to give their daughters in marriage to anyone from Benjamin, so even if they don't kill the few men who are left, the tribe is still going to die out. What are they to do? Well, they asked God for ideas, of course, and God's idea was to find one of the towns that didn't show up at the meeting where they swore not to marry their daughters to the Benjaminites, and then kill everyone in that town aside from the virgin girls, and then those girls can now be wives for the men of Benjamin. So God's plan to avoid committing a total genocide on a tribe for the actions of a few people in a town of that tribe was to commit a different genocide and then force the survivors into sex slavery with the people who, just 2 chapters earlier, were so evil as to deserve extermination. This is the morality on display from the God of the Bible. So no, I can't say that I'd like that guy if it turned out that he was real. But my not liking the character does not mean that I really secretly do believe that he's real and I hate him. It's that I am capable of disliking fictional characters when reading stories. I didn't much care for the character of Ted Sandyman in The Lord of the Rings. He's the main hobbit that worked with Saruman when he took over the Shire at the end of The Return of the King. Not a great guy. Didn't care for him at all. If I learned that he is real, I would not want to be his friend. And none of this means that I actually secretly believe that he is real and I'm just denying that fact in order to avoid having to be friends with him. It just means that I understood the story to be fictional. And that's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from... Just a sec, let me see if he's available.
Hello?
I know it was you, Gary.
Yeah, I threw them a softball.
Well, they fumbled it.
But, really?
Yeah. Yeah, as I thought, it was Gary, whose holy merch you can buy at merch.vicerhino.com. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I live stream with Cirrus every Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Cirrus voiced Gary today, by the way. Thanks to Piper for being my editor and animator in this one. And special thanks as always to my patrons, Michelle and all the rest, who are the demons from the divided house that is my channel. If you'd like to trick Greg with the easiest lie that it's possible to tell, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time! I wanna know, have you ever seen
it's not
rain?
clear to me that the
No. I'm picturing the Bugs Bunny meme with his lips like out being like, no.